My eyes snapped open. Silence. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, pregnant with unseen possibilities. My room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside my window. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. What had woken me? Then I heard it. A soft creak. It came again, a whisper of sound from the direction of my balcony door. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through me. Someone was out there. I held my breath, listening intently. The floorboards groaned softly. Someone was trying to be quiet, but they were definitely there. My mind raced. Was it a burglar? An animal? I had to do something. But what? Suddenly the curtains on the balcony door rustled. A figure, tall and silhouetted against the moonlight, moved into view. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Terror, pure and paralyzing, gripped me. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Who was it? What did they want? The figure fumbled with something, and then the soft glow of a lighter flickered on. My blood ran cold. I knew that lighter. I knew the hand that held it. It was Zade. Zade, with his dark, brooding eyes and his reputation for trouble. Zade, who I'd tried so hard to ignore for the past year. What was he doing here in the middle of the night on my balcony? I watched as he lit a cigarette, the orange glow illuminating his face in the darkness. He looked different somehow, older, more haunted. His jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes held a mixture of pain and defiance that I'd never seen before. For a moment, our eyes met across the short distance. I saw a flicker of surprise in his gaze, followed quickly by something else. Relief, or maybe something more like desperation. The shock must have shown on my face because Zade quickly took a step back. "Don't freak out," he said, his voice low and husky. "I just needed..." He trailed off, looking away for a moment as if unsure how to continue. Needed what? I finally found my voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. Fear was still coursing through me, but it was mingled now with something else. Confusion, anger, and maybe just a flicker of something like concern. Zade ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture I'd seen him do 100 times before. It was a nervous habit, one that always made him seem younger than he was, but tonight it only seemed to emphasize the tension radiating from him. "Look," he said, finally meeting my gaze again. "Can I just come in for a minute? We need to talk." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I hesitated, torn between my better judgment and the strange sense of urgency that emanated from him. He looked so lost, so alone. Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. Zade and I had a complicated history. We'd grown up together, two kids running wild in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's secrets. We'd been inseparable once, best friends who shared everything. But then high school happened, and everything changed. Zade started hanging out with a different crowd, getting into trouble. I focused on my studies, on getting out of our small town and making something of myself. We drifted apart, our paths diverging like two rivers flowing in opposite directions. There were whispers, of course, rumors of fights, of drugs, of Zade getting in too deep with the wrong people. I'd tried not to listen, tried to pretend that the boy I'd known was still somewhere inside the brooding, angry young man he'd become. But it was hard. And now here he was, standing in my bedroom in the middle of the night, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him before. The weight of our shared history, of all the unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings, settled between us like a thick fog. "You look like you could use this." I gestured towards my desk chair, its back to him. He turned it to face me before collapsing into it. His shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. A wave of something akin to pity washed over me. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a pain that made my chest ache. "I messed up," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I messed up bad." I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there watching him. Silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the soft whir of the ceiling fan and the occasional sniffle from Zade. The urge to comfort him, to reach out and soothe away the pain etched on his face was almost overwhelming. As if reading my thoughts, Zade suddenly sat up straight and turned to face me. "Can I ask you something?" he asked, his voice rough. "Sure," I replied cautiously, unsure what to expect. Can you just..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to his hands, which were clenched tightly in his lap. "My shoulders are so tense," he mumbled, almost inaudibly. hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond, but the look on his face, so open and vulnerable, disarmed me. I found myself nodding, and then I was standing behind him, my hands hovering hesitantly over his shoulders. Section 6, Whispers of Trauma. "It's okay," I murmured, my fingers tentatively kneading the tight knots in his shoulders. He flinched slightly at my touch, but then he relaxed back into it, a soft sigh escaping his lips. "Thanks," he whispered, his eyes closed. "I needed that." We stayed like that for a while, me massaging the tension from his shoulders, him sitting silently, his head bowed. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was filled with a strange intimacy, a shared understanding that transcended words. As I worked on his shoulders, I couldn't help but notice how tense he was. His muscles were like rocks beneath my fingers, a testament to the turmoil raging within him. What had happened to shake him up so badly? Finally, Zade spoke, his voice low and shaky. "There was this girl," he began, and then he stopped, as if unsure whether to continue. I waited patiently, giving him the space he needed to gather his thoughts. "She was young," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Too young." And he trailed off again, his body racked with a shudder. I knew better than to press him, but I couldn't help but feel a surge of concern. What had he gotten himself into, and who was this girl? Section 7, Comfort in the Darkness. Zade took a deep, shuddering breath and continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. He told me about the girl, about how he'd found her passed out at a party, about how he'd tried to help her, but it had been too late. His voice cracked with emotion as he described the scene, the flashing lights, the pounding music, the girl's lifeless eyes staring up at him. I could hear the guilt and the anguish in every word, and my heart ached for him. "It wasn't my fault," he whispered, his voice breaking, but it felt like it. It felt like I should have been able to do something, anything to save her. I didn't know what to say, so I just kept massaging his shoulders, offering him what little comfort I could through touch. He leaned into my touch as if drawing strength from it. "I keep seeing her face," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I can't get it out of my head." Tears welled up in his eyes, and he quickly brushed them away, as if ashamed to be showing such vulnerability, but I saw them, and in that moment, I saw past the tough exterior, past the bad boy facade, and I saw the scared, hurting boy he truly was. Section 8, A Glimmer of Hope. "It's okay to cry, Zade," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Let it out." And he did. He cried, great racking sobs that shook his entire body. I held him close, offering him what little comfort I could. As I held him, I realized that this was the closest we'd been in years. The years of anger, resentment, and hurt seemed to melt away, leaving only a raw, shared pain. In that moment, there were no secrets, no pretenses, just two souls seeking solace in each other's arms. As his sobs subsided, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't a happy peace, not exactly. It was more like a shared grief, a recognition of the pain and suffering that existed in the world, and the understanding that sometimes all we could do was be there for each other. "Thank you," Zade whispered, finally lifting his head from my shoulder. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he had a faint smile on his face. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." "You would have been fine," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "No, I wouldn't have," he insisted, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "I wouldn't have." Section 9, A Bond Forged in the Night. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to peek through the curtains when Zade finally left that morning. He stood on my balcony for a long moment, looking out at the horizon as if trying to memorize the view. "I should go," he said finally, turning back to me. He looked different than he had when he'd arrived. The tension that had been etched on his face had eased, replaced by a look of quiet gratitude. "Be careful, Zade," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. He nodded, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I will," he promised, "and thanks again for everything." And then he was gone, disappearing into the growing light of dawn, like a shadow returning to the night. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where he'd been standing, my heart a strange mix of relief, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. As I closed the balcony door and turned back to my room, I knew that things would never be the same between us. The events of that night had forged a bond between us, a connection that went deeper than friendship or even shared history. And as I crawled back into bed, exhausted but strangely at peace, I couldn't help but wonder where this newfound connection might lead us.